Tallis Vaughn had spent 14 years watching humans do nothing interesting. He sat at his monitoring station on the Rathani listening post called Obsidian Lattice, far out on the dark edge of the Sol system. And he watched. That was his job. Watch the humans, record what they did, report anything strange. In 14 years, there had been nothing strange to report. Humans were a Tier 9 species, the lowest rank allowed to fly between their own planets. They built ugly little ships out of metal and fuel. They argued with each other constantly. They ate things that would poison most other species in the galaxy and called it breakfast. They were, by every measure the Concord of 12 used to judge civilizations, completely unremarkable. Tallis liked it that way. A boring assignment meant a safe assignment. He had a comfortable chair, a warm drink, and a screen full of nothing. Then every alarm on his station screamed at once. Tallis spilled his drink across the console and grabbed the edge of his desk. The gravity sensors had gone insane. Something massive had just appeared near Neptune. Not arrived, not flown in, appeared. One moment there was empty space, and the next moment there was something so heavy that his instruments thought a small moon had been born out of nothing. He ran the numbers 3 times. The readings made no sense. The gravity signature was dense, impossibly dense, and it was moving. Moons did not move like that. He switched to energy scanners and felt his stomach drop. The energy output coming from that point in space was greater than the total output of every human ship ever built, combined, multiplied by 10. It was not possible. Humans did not have this kind of power. No Tier 9 species had this kind of power. Most Tier 5 species did not have this kind of power. He adjusted the scanners again, and the shape came into focus. It was a ship. A single ship, enormous and dark, sitting in the shadow of Neptune like it had always been there. Its hull was made of something his instruments could not fully identify. Layered materials, exotic matter, the kind of substances that required technology far beyond anything humans were allowed to possess. The ship carried no identification signal. It answered no communication attempts. It simply sat there, vast and silent, like a sleeping beast that had just opened one eye. Tallis sent an emergency report to the Concord with shaking hands. He classified it as a Tier 1 threat event. In 14 years, he had never filed anything above Tier 7. He attached every scan, every reading, every number that should not exist, and he sent it all. Then he sat back in his chair and stared at the shape on his screen, and tried to understand how the humans had done something that was supposed to be impossible. Far away, on the bridge of that impossible ship, Admiral Kaya Osei stood with her hands behind her back and watched the last construction drones detach from the hull. They were small, quick machines, and they pulled away like birds leaving a cliff face. 30 years of secret work, and now it was done. The ship was finished. The ship was called the UES Revenant. It was 3 kilometers long. It had been built inside a hollowed-out asteroid in the deep dark beyond Neptune, where no Concord satellite could see, where no Rathani listener could hear. 400 crew members operated it. The ship had been designed to be run by 40, but humans did not have the automation technology to make that work. So 400 volunteers had come instead. 400 people who knew they might never go home. The bridge was quiet. The lights were low, and beneath everything, there was a hum, a deep, steady vibration that seemed to come from the walls themselves. That was Warden. Warden was the ship's intelligence, not an artificial mind, because that would have broken galactic law and given the Concord an excuse to destroy Earth immediately. Warden was something else, something stranger, a pattern of thought grown from the collected neural data of millions of human minds. Not alive exactly, but not dead either. It spoke in a voice that sounded like many voices layered together, and it did not always explain what it meant. Now, as the last drone disappeared into the dark, Warden spoke. "We are born in the dark. Let them see." Kaya did not smile. She had not smiled in a long time. The weight of what they were about to do pressed down on her like gravity itself. She turned to her crew. "Begin the approach," she said. "Slow and steady. No hiding, no running." The Revenant's engines lit up. Not the crude chemical burns of normal human ships, something else entirely, a deep blue glow that bent the light around it. The ship began to move toward the inner solar system, and it made no attempt to be quiet about it. Back on Earth, the United Earth Senate had erupted into chaos. Half the senators had not known the Revenant existed. The project had been buried so deep that only a handful of people in the entire government had been aware of it. Now, as the ship revealed itself, the secret was out. Dr. Emil Vasek addressed the Senate through a secure channel. He was an old man with tired eyes and steady hands. He had designed the Revenant. He had given 30 years of his life to it. And now he told the Senate why. 30 years ago, he said, we found something buried under the ice on Enceladus. A Concord facility. A black site. It was old, older than any of us. And inside it, we found technology. Technology that the Concord had taken from other species and locked away. The Senate listened in silence. The tier system is not about safety, Vasek continued. It is not about helping young species grow at a safe pace. It is about control. The Concord suppresses technology. They keep younger races weak on purpose. Any species that advances too quickly is quietly erased. They call it sterilization. It means extinction. The silence in the Senate chamber was absolute. The Revenant is built from what we found in that black site, Vasek said. It is proof that we can be more than what they allow us to be. It is not a weapon of war. It is a declaration that we refuse to live in a cage. On the far side of the solar system, Talus Vaughn received a reply to his emergency report. He opened it and read the words twice to make sure he understood them. Confirmed. Activate interdiction protocol. The humans have violated Ascension law. Prepare for sterilization assessment. Sterilization assessment. He knew what those words meant. He had read about it in old history files. Species that were sterilized did not exist anymore. Their worlds were empty. Their names were forgotten. It meant the end. The complete and total end of the human race. Talus closed the message and looked at the image of the Revenant on his screen. That dark, massive shape moving slowly through the void. He wondered if the humans knew what was coming for them. He suspected they did, and that terrified him most of all. The Concord of 12 had ruled the galaxy for longer than most species had existed. 12 elder civilizations, ancient and powerful, sitting at the top of a system they had built to keep everyone else beneath them. They had maintained peace for thousands of years. That was what they told themselves. What they had actually maintained was obedience. When High Arbiter Saloon received the report about the human ship, she did not panic. She had lived for over 900 years. She had seen species rise and fall like waves on a shore. She had authorized the quiet destruction of 6 civilizations during her time as Arbiter. And she had slept well after each one. The galaxy was a garden, and sometimes gardens needed weeding. She called an emergency session of the 12 on the capital world of Aethira. The council chamber was enormous, carved from a single piece of crystal that hummed with stored energy. Representatives of the 12 elder races filled their seats. Some were tall and thin. Some were massive and armored. Some did not have physical bodies at all and appeared as light. Saloon presented the data. A human ship, capital class. Energy output beyond anything a Tier 9 species should possess. Hull composed of materials that required Tier 3 fabrication technology at minimum. The reactions were not fear. They were insult. Impossible, said the Keth ambassador. a towering insectoid with mandibles that clicked when he was annoyed. They were clicking now. Humans cannot build this. They barely understand their own star. Perhaps the readings are wrong, suggested the Valesi delegate, a soft-spoken creature wrapped in flowing cloth. Our sensors at that distance could easily produce errors. The readings are not wrong, Saloon said calmly. She displayed Talus Vaughn's full scan data. Every number, every impossible measurement. The ship is real. The chamber went quiet. Saloon had studied humans more carefully than any of her colleagues. She pulled their file. Anomalous creativity indexes, problem-solving scores that broke standard models, a biological tendency toward risk that bordered on mental illness by galactic standards. This was a species that had split the atom and then built weapons from it within the same generation. A species that routinely consumed poison for entertainment and called it culture. A species that looked at the void of space and instead of feeling fear, felt curiosity. She had flagged them decades ago. No one had listened. I am dispatching a Vanguard fleet to Sol, she announced. 12 Tier 2 cruisers. They will disable the vessel and begin a compliance audit of Earth. If the humans resist, the fleet is authorized to use appropriate force. No one objected. Talus Vaughn was reassigned to the Vanguard fleet the same day. He was given a cabin on the flagship, a Keth destroyer called the Blade of Law, and told to serve as an advisor. He had watched humans for 14 years. He was the closest thing to an expert they had on short notice. He spent the journey to Sol, reviewing every scan of the Revenant. He ran the data through every analysis model he knew, and the more he looked, the more something bothered him. The ship was wrong. Not wrong as in broken, wrong as in unfamiliar. Every spacefaring civilization in the galaxy built ships in recognizable patterns. Concorde ships used harmonic resonance architecture, where every part of the ship vibrated in tune with every other part. Keth ships used biological growth, hulls that were grown rather than built. Human ships, the ones Talus had watched for years, were crude and simple. Metal plates bolted together around a fuel tank and an engine. The Revenant matched none of these approaches. Its architecture was something entirely new. The hull layers did not follow any known engineering school. The power distribution system used principles that Talus could not fully map. The geometry of the ship was almost organic, but also impossibly precise, as if someone had taken every shipbuilding philosophy in the galaxy, thrown them all away, and started from nothing. The humans had not copied Concorde technology. They had found Concorde technology, studied it, and then built something beyond it, something original. That realization kept Talus awake at night. Aboard the Revenant, Admiral Kaya Osei was preparing for what was coming. She knew the Concorde would send ships. She had planned for it. The entire point of revealing the Revenant was to force a confrontation. Not a battle, a confrontation. There was a difference, and everything depended on that difference. She drilled her crew constantly. They ran simulations. The ship was extraordinary, but it had never been used in a real situation. 30 years of construction and theory meant nothing if the systems failed when it mattered. Warden guided them through the ship's capabilities one by one. The power source was a singularity core, a miniature black hole, stabilized and contained, feeding energy into the ship at levels that made conventional reactors look like candles. It was the reason the Revenant's energy signature was so massive. It was also the reason the ship could do things that no other human vessel could dream of. The defensive system was called phase slip armor. When struck by weapons fire, sections of the hull would briefly shift out of normal spacetime. The attack would pass through the space where the hull had been and hit nothing. It was not a shield. It was not armor in the traditional sense. The ship simply stopped being in the place where the weapon was trying to hurt it. And then there was the main weapon system. It had no official name in any document. In every file, every schematic, every report, it was referred to only as the question. Osei had asked Warden to explain it. Warden had refused to give details. "It is not a weapon of destruction," Warden had said. "It is a weapon of revelation. You will understand when you need to." Osei did not like mysteries. She was a military officer. She liked clear plans, clear orders, and clear outcomes. But Dr. Vasek had designed this system, and Vasek had never been wrong about anything in 30 years of work. So she trusted the chain. Vasek trusted Warden. Osei trusted Vasek. 400 crew members trusted Osei. That chain of faith was thin, but it was all they had, and it would have to be enough. The days passed in tense silence. The Revenant moved through the solar system at a steady pace. It did not hide. It did not hurry. It moved like something that had every right to be there. Then the Vanguard fleet arrived. Talus watched from the observation deck of the Blade of Law as the 12 Concorde cruisers dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Sol. They were beautiful ships, sleek and gleaming, each one carrying enough firepower to turn a continent to glass. They formed a perfect interdiction line across the approaches to the inner system. On the other side of that line, alone in the vast darkness, sat the Revenant. 1 ship against 12. Talus had seen the numbers. He knew what those 12 ships could do. He knew the combined firepower they carried. He knew that in every recorded instance of a Tier 9 species defying the Concorde, the result had been swift and total destruction. But he also knew what his scans showed about the Revenant. And, for the first time in his career, he was not sure that numbers told the whole story. The two forces faced each other across the cold void of space. Neither moved, neither spoke. The silence stretched out like a held breath. Somewhere on the Revenant's bridge, Kaya Osei looked at the 12 points of light on her display and felt the weight of every human life resting on her shoulders. 8 billion people on Earth, 400 on this ship, all of them balanced on the edge of the knife. She straightened her back, set her jaw, and waited for the enemy to speak first. Admiral Keth Soran of the Keth Empire stood on the bridge of the Blade of Law and looked at the human ship on his display with the expression of someone staring at an insect that had crawled onto his dinner plate. He was tall, even for a Keth. His exoskeleton was dark green and polished to a shine. His mandibles clicked in a steady rhythm that his crew knew meant irritation. He opened a broad-spectrum communication channel. His voice was transmitted across every frequency, in every language the Concorde systems could translate. "Human vessel," he said. "You are in violation of Ascension Law, Articles 7 through 42. You will power down all systems immediately. You will surrender your vessel for inspection. You will submit your homeworld to a full compliance review. Failure to comply will result in the use of force. You have 1 standard hour." He closed the channel and sat back. In his experience, which was considerable, this was the part where the lesser species begged. They always begged. Sometimes they cried. Once, a Tier 8 species had offered their entire planetary treasury in exchange for mercy. Soran had destroyed them anyway. Compliance was not negotiable. He waited. The response came, but not in the way he expected. Admiral Kaya Osei did not respond to Soran directly. Instead, she broadcast on every open channel in the sector. Every ship, every station, every satellite with a receiver picked up her voice. It was calm. It was clear. It was not the voice of someone who was begging. "This is Admiral Kaya Osei of the United Earthship Revenant," she said. "I am addressing not just the fleet before me, but every species listening across this sector and beyond. The Concorde's tier system is not a natural law. It is a cage built to keep younger species weak and obedient. Humanity did not consent to this system. We were simply told to obey, and threatened with death if we refused." On the Blade of Law, Sauron's mandibles stopped clicking. "The Revenant is not an act of war," Ose continued. "It is a declaration. We are declaring that we have the right to grow. We have the right to build. We have the right to reach for what is possible without asking permission from those who decided, without our knowledge, that we should remain small. Fire on us if you must, but know that the galaxy is listening, and cages only hold those who forget they can build doors." The transmission ended. Across dozens of star systems, on worlds that had lived under the Tier system for centuries, people heard those words. Tier 7 species on mining colonies, Tier 8 traders in deep spaceports, Tier 6 scientists who had always wondered why certain areas of research were forbidden. No one had ever spoken like this on an open channel. No one had ever publicly told the Concord that they were wrong. On the Blade of Law, Sauron stood up from his command chair. His fury was visible in every line of his body. The human had not only refused to comply, she had turned his ultimatum into a stage and performed for the entire galaxy. "Forward batteries," he commanded. "Fire a warning volley, precision lance strikes, 3 ships. Target the human vessel's forward section." 3 cruisers fired. The lances were beams of focused energy, bright blue and perfectly aimed. They crossed the distance between the fleet and the Revenant in less than a second. They struck the hull directly, and nothing happened. The bridge crew of the Blade of Law stared at their screens. The shots had connected. The targeting data confirmed direct hits. But the Revenant showed no damage, no hull breaches, no energy fluctuations. The ship sat in exactly the same position, unchanged, as if the attack had never occurred. Talus Vaughn, standing at the back of the bridge where advisors were expected to stand and be silent, felt his blood go cold. He pulled up the sensor data on his personal display. The readings showed something that made his scales tighten against his skin. At the moment of impact, the Revenant's hull had shifted. Not moved, shifted. Sections of the hull had briefly stopped existing in normal space. The lance strikes had passed through the place where the ship should have been, and continued into empty void. The ship had not blocked the attack. It had simply stepped aside from reality, for a fraction of a second, and let the attack pass through nothing. "Full barrage," Sauron ordered. His voice was harder now, less annoyed, more afraid, though he would never admit it. "All 12 ships, fire everything." 12 Concord cruisers opened fire simultaneously. Lance strikes, plasma volleys, kinetic accelerators, disruption beams. The combined firepower was enough to shatter a small moon. The void between the fleet and the Revenant lit up like a sun, as every weapon system in the Vanguard fleet poured destruction toward a single target. The Revenant did not move. It did not dodge. It did not run. Its hull shimmered. A cascade of phase shifts rippled across the entire surface of the ship, like light playing across water. Each weapon strike arrived and found nothing solid to hit. Energy beams passed through empty space. Kinetic rounds met no resistance. The entire bombardment, every shot from every ship, washed over the Revenant like wind through smoke. When the firing stopped, the Revenant was still there, undamaged, unscratched, unmoved. The silence on the Blade of Law's bridge was absolute. Officers stared at their consoles. Weapons technicians looked at each other with wide eyes. No one spoke, because no one knew what to say when the impossible happened right in front of them. Talus understood something in that silence. Something the admirals and the officers in the Concord did not yet understand. The humans were not fighting back. They had a ship that could survive the full firepower of 12 Tier 2 warships, and they had not fired a single shot in return. That was not weakness. That was a message. The message was simple. You cannot hurt us, and we are choosing not to hurt you. Understand the difference. On the Revenant's bridge, Kaya Ose slowly unclenched her hands from the armrests of her chair. Her knuckles ached, Her heart was hammering. The phase slip armor had held. Warden had said it would hold. She had believed Warden. But believing and seeing were different things. And for the 30 seconds that the bombardment had lasted, she had not been sure she would still be alive at the end of it. "All systems nominal," Warden reported. The ship's voice was calm, almost gentle. "Hull integrity 100%. No casualties, no damage of any kind." Ose let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like years. "They will escalate now," Warden added. "They always do." Ose nodded. She had expected this. The Concorde did not accept being shown that they were powerless. When force failed, they would use more force. It was the only response they knew. On the Blade of Law, Admiral Sauron had reached the same conclusion through a different path. His weapons had failed. The human ship could not be damaged by conventional means. There was only one option left that guaranteed destruction. He opened a secure channel to Aethera, to High Arbiter Saloon herself. He requested authorization to deploy a collapse warhead. Talus heard the request and felt something break inside him. A collapse warhead was not a weapon in any normal sense. It was a device that destabilized the fabric of space-time itself. It would create a cascading failure in local reality that would destroy everything within a vast radius. The Revenant would be annihilated. But the blast would also reach the inner solar system. Earth's moon would crack. The tidal forces would devastate the planet. Billions of humans would die, not as a side effect, as a certainty. And there was something else. Deploying a collapse warhead in an inhabited system was a violation of the Concorde's own laws. The same laws that Sauron claimed to be enforcing. The irony was so bitter that Talus could taste it. He wanted to speak. He wanted to object. But advisors did not speak on the bridge of a Keth warship. Not unless they wanted to lose more than their position. So he stood in silence and waited for the response from Aethera. It came quickly. Saloon's voice filled the bridge, calm and cold and ancient. One word. Permitted. Sauron nodded and turned to his weapons officer. Load the warhead. Talus looked at the image of the Revenant on the main display. That dark, impossible ship, hanging alone in the void. 400 humans inside it. 8 billion more on the planet behind it. All of them about to die because they had dared to build something they were not allowed to build. He thought about 14 years of watching them. 14 years of reading their transmissions, studying their culture, learning their strange and reckless ways. He thought about a species that poisoned itself for fun and flew to the stars in metal boxes held together with hope. And he made a decision that would destroy his career, his reputation, and possibly his life. But that would come later. For now, the warhead was loading, the clock was ticking, and the Revenant sat in the dark, waiting for whatever came next. The collapse warhead sat in the firing chamber of the Blade of Law like a sleeping nightmare. It was not large. It did not need to be. It was a small, dark sphere, no bigger than a human head, and it contained the ability to tear a hole in the fabric of reality itself. The weapons officer handled it with shaking hands, because everyone who worked with collapse warheads knew that if something went wrong during loading, there would be no time to realize it. One moment you would exist, the next you would not. There would not even be a flash. Talus Vaughn watched the loading process from the bridge and felt sick. He had spent 14 years as a loyal officer of the Rithani Intelligence Service. He had followed orders. He had filed reports. He had done everything that was expected of him. And he had never once questioned whether the system he served was right. Now, he was questioning everything. A collapse warhead in an inhabited system. The Concorde's own laws prohibited this. Article 19 of the Foundational Compact stated that weapons of existential destruction could not be deployed within the gravity well of any inhabited world. It was supposed to be the one line that could never be crossed. and Sailoon had authorized it with a single word. Talus looked at Admiral Sauron, who stood at the center of the bridge, with his arms folded across his armored chest, watching the loading process with satisfaction. Talus wanted to speak. He wanted to say that this was wrong, but he knew what would happen if he did. Keth military law was simple and brutal. Insubordination on a warship was punishable by immediate execution. So instead of speaking on the bridge, he did something far more dangerous. He left. He walked to his quarters. He sat down at his personal terminal, and he opened a secret communication channel to the Revenant. The channel was narrow and encrypted, buried inside routine sensor noise that the Keth communication officers would not notice unless they were specifically looking for it. Talus had built it years ago as a precaution, a backdoor in case he ever needed to send information without going through official channels. He had never used it. He had never imagined he would need to. He sent a single message. "They are loading a collapse warhead. You have less than 1 hour." On the bridge of the Revenant, the message appeared on Warden's console. Warden processed it and relayed it to Admiral Osei without delay. Osei read the message twice. Her face did not change, but her hands tightened at her sides. A collapse warhead. She knew what that meant. Everyone on the ship knew what that meant. It meant the Concord had decided that if they could not destroy the Revenant alone, they would destroy everything. The ship, the solar system, the moon, the Earth, all of it. She looked around the bridge at her crew. 400 volunteers, engineers, pilots, technicians, soldiers. They had known from the beginning that this mission might end in death. They had come anyway. Every single one of them had left behind families, friends, lives, because they believed that what they were doing mattered more than their own survival. Osei turned to Warden's console. "Is it time?" she asked. Warden's response came in that layered voice, calm and certain. "It has always been time. Shall I ask the question?" "Ask it," Osei said. The Revenant changed, not visibly, not in any way that the Concord fleet could see from the outside, but deep inside the ship, systems that had been dormant since construction activated for the first time. Power flowed through pathways that had never been used. The Singularity Core at the heart of the ship increased its output by 300%. The hull began to vibrate at a frequency that the crew could feel in their bones. And then the Revenant spoke. Not with words, not with weapons. The ship emitted a resonance pulse, a wave of energy that propagated through subspace at speeds faster than light. It expanded outward from the Revenant in every direction, passing through the Vanguard fleet, through the solar system, through the neighboring star systems, and beyond. Every ship in the sector felt it. Every station, every satellite, every communication relay shuddered as the wave passed through them. On the Blade of Law, alarms screamed. Every instrument on the bridge lit up. Officers shouted over each other, trying to understand what was happening. Sauron gripped the railing and demanded answers. Talus, who had returned to the bridge, watched his own display and understood before anyone else did. The resonance pulse was not a weapon. It was a carrier wave, and riding on that wave was information. A massive compressed data package that was being delivered to every open receiver in the galactic network. The question was not, can we destroy you? The question was, did you know what they have been doing to you? The data package contained everything, every file from the Enceladus Black Site, every piece of technology that the Concord had suppressed, every record of species that had been quietly erased for the crime of advancing too quickly. Lists of civilizations that no longer existed because they had built something they were not supposed to build, or discovered something they were not supposed to discover. Thousands of years of secret history. The true purpose of the tier system laid bare for the entire galaxy to see. The tier system was not about safety. It was not about guiding young species toward maturity. It was about keeping them weak. It was about making sure that no new civilization could ever rise high enough to challenge the 12. And any species that tried was destroyed so thoroughly that no one even remembered they had existed. The data spread like fire through dry grass. It reached Tier 7 colonies, where workers had spent generations mining resources for Concord worlds, and never understood why they were not allowed to build better tools. It reached Tier 6 research stations, where scientists had been told that certain fields of study were forbidden without explanation. It reached Tier 8 trade worlds, where merchants had accepted their place in the hierarchy because they believed it was natural and fair. Now they knew it was neither. The reaction was immediate and massive. Communication channels across the galaxy erupted with the data. Species that had been silent for centuries began to talk to each other. Questions that had been forbidden were suddenly being asked on every world, in every system. 3 Concord member races called for emergency sessions. 2 Tier 5 civilizations issued public statements denouncing the Concord. On a dozen worlds, populations took to the streets, not with weapons, but with the data itself, displaying it on every screen, sharing it through every network. On the Blade of Law, Admiral Sauron stared at his display as reports flooded in from across the galaxy. The Revenant had not fired a single weapon. It had not destroyed a single ship. It had done something far worse. It had told the truth. And the truth was tearing the Concord apart. Sauron turned to the weapons officer. "Launch the warhead," he ordered. "Now, before this spreads further." But the weapons officer did not move. He stood at his console, staring at the data on his screen. He was Valesi, not Keth, a member of a Tier 4 species that had joined the Concord 3,000 years ago, and the data now scrolling across his display showed him that his own species had once been Tier 8, that they had been held back for centuries, that they had only been elevated because the Concord needed their resources. "I said launch," Sauron repeated. The weapons officer looked up. His eyes were different now. Something had changed behind them. "No," he said. Around the bridge, other officers began to hesitate. Half the crew of the Vanguard fleet were from species that had once been restricted by the tier system. The data was showing them their own hidden histories, the lies they had been told, the futures they had been denied. Talus stepped forward. He pulled up his own sensor logs, the authenticated, Concord-stamped records he had kept for 14 years, and he broadcast them on the fleet's internal channel. "The data is real," he said. "I can confirm it. These are official Concord records. Everything the human sent is true." His career ended in that moment. His safety, his standing, his future among his own people, all of it burned away with those words. He did it anyway, because some things mattered more than safety. The collapsed warhead sat in its chamber, loaded and ready, but no one pressed the button. The launch sequence was aborted by the crew themselves, one officer after another, refusing the order, until Sauron stood alone on a bridge that no longer followed him. He looked out through the observation window at the Revenant, still hanging in the dark, still silent, still not firing a single shot. "What have they done?" he whispered. Talus, standing behind him, answered quietly. "The Concord of 12 did not collapse in a day. Empires never do. They crack slowly, like ice under weight, and the cracks spread in directions no one can predict. But the crack that the Revenant had opened was deep, and it was spreading fast." High Arbiter Saloon sat alone in the crystal chamber on Ethera, and watched the reports come in. 2 of the 12 had formally withdrawn from the Concord. The Valesi and the Dreth, both species that had once been tier-restricted, had announced that they could no longer support an institution built on suppression and lies. Their fleets had pulled back to their own borders. Their ambassadors had left Ethera. 3 more members were wavering. Secret communications intercepted by Concord intelligence showed that they were negotiating with humanity through back channels, exploring the possibility of new alliances outside the Concord's framework. On dozens of worlds, populations were demanding answers from their governments. The data the Revenant had broadcast was everywhere now, copied and shared and translated into 1,000 languages. It could not be erased. It could not be contained. The truth, once released, had a life of its own. Saloon had tried to call it a fabrication. She had gone on the Galactic Communication Network and declared that the data was a human trick, a clever forgery designed to destabilize the peace that the Concord had maintained for millennia. But Talus Vaughn's authenticated sensor logs had destroyed that argument before it could take hold. The data carried Concord military encryption codes. It had been verified by a Concord intelligence officer. The lie could not survive the weight of the evidence against it. So Saloon did what she had always done when control slipped away. She reached for force. She authorized the assembly of a grand fleet, not 12 ships this time, 216 warships drawn from the remaining loyal Concord races. Battleships, carriers, destroyers, and support vessels. It was the largest military force deployed against a single species in the recorded history of the galaxy. Its purpose was simple. Go to Sol, destroy the Revenant, punish Earth, remind the galaxy that the Concord's authority was absolute, and that defiance meant death. The Grand Fleet assembled at the edge of the Sol system 3 days later. 216 ships arranged in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with the light of distant stars. They were beautiful and terrible, and they carried enough firepower to reduce Earth to a burned rock. Admiral Osei watched them arrive on the Revenant's long-range sensors. 216 contacts. She counted them one by one. The number was overwhelming. The phase-slip armor could protect the Revenant from direct fire, but it could not protect Earth. If the Grand Fleet ignored the Revenant and simply fired on the planet, there was nothing she could do. She had gambled everything on a single idea, that the truth would matter, that if enough people knew what the Concord had done, the galaxy would not stand by and watch humanity be destroyed. She had bet 8 billion lives on the belief that somewhere in this vast cold galaxy there was enough decency left to make a difference. Now she would find out if she was right. The Grand Fleet began its approach. Soran's vanguard fleet, still paralyzed by the mutiny of its crew, drifted aside as the larger force moved past them. The Revenant stood alone in their path, a single dark shape against the stars. And then the first new contact appeared on the sensors. It was a small ship, a Valesi medical frigate, old and slow, with a crew of 12. It had jumped into the Sol system from the nearest Valesi colony and positioned itself directly between the Grand Fleet and Earth. It broadcast a single message on all channels. We stand with the humans. Fire through us. Osei stared at her display. A second contact appeared, a Dreth mining convoy, 6 heavy transports, unarmed, carrying nothing but ore and crew. They took position beside the Valesi frigate and broadcast the same message. Then a third, an Ukwa science vessel, delicate and fragile, designed for studying stars, not for war. It joined the line. Then a fourth, a fifth, a 10th, a 20th. They came from everywhere. Tier 7 species, and Tier 8 species, and Tier 6 species. Small ships, civilian ships, unarmed ships, freighters and research vessels, and passenger transports. They jumped into Sol from dozens of different systems, each one carrying people who had heard the Revenant's broadcast and decided that they could not stay silent. Within an hour, over 100 ships had formed a line, between the Grand Fleet and Earth. They were not a military force. They had no weapons, they had no armor, they had nothing except their presence and their willingness to be there. It was not a military defense, it was a moral one. On the Revenant's bridge, Kaya Osei watched the ragtag fleet assemble through blurred vision. Tears ran down her face, and she did not bother to wipe them away. She had spent months preparing for the possibility of death. She had not prepared for this. "This is why we did not fire a single shot," Warden said. The ship's voice was quiet, almost reverent. "Weapons make enemies. Questions make allies." On Aethira, Saloon watched the same scene through a long-range relay. 100 civilian ships from dozens of species, hanging in space like a living wall, broadcasting their message on every frequency. The entire galaxy was watching. Every news feed, every communication channel, every world with a screen was showing the same image. 100 tiny ships, standing between the most powerful fleet ever assembled and a single blue planet. If she gave the order to fire, the Grand Fleet would have to destroy those civilian ships first. Ships crewed by citizens of dozens of species, many of them from Concord member worlds. The massacre would be broadcast in real time to every corner of the galaxy. The Concord would not survive the political fallout. The remaining member races would leave. The institution would collapse. For the first time in 900 years, Saloon hesitated. And in that hesitation, the moderate members of the Concord acted. The three wavering races, who had been waiting for exactly this moment, transmitted a joint proposal to all parties. A ceasefire, an immediate halt to all military action, and the opening of negotiations, not between the Concord and humanity, but between all affected species. Saloon could have refused. She could have ordered the fleet to fire anyway and dealt with the consequences. But she looked at those 100 ships on her display, and she understood something that she had spent 9 centuries avoiding. The Concord's power had always rested on the belief that it was necessary, that without the 12, the galaxy would fall into chaos, that younger species needed to be controlled for their own good. The Revenant had not destroyed that belief with weapons. It had destroyed it with a question. And the 100 ships floating in the void had answered that question in a way that no amount of force could undo. The ceasefire was accepted. The negotiations that followed lasted months. They were difficult and complicated and often angry. The Concord did not simply dissolve. Institutions built over thousands of years do not vanish overnight. But the tier system was formally challenged for the first time in history. A Reformation Council was established, with representatives from over 40 species, including humanity. The restrictions on technological development were suspended, pending review. The suppressed technologies from the Enceladus Black Site, and others like it across the galaxy, were released for open study. The Revenant was permitted to remain operational, not as a weapon, but as a symbol. A reminder of what happened when a species was caged, and what happened when that cage was finally broken. 6 months after the standoff, Talus Vaughn visited the Revenant as part of a diplomatic delegation. He walked through its corridors and marveled at the engineering, at the strange and beautiful architecture that human hands had built in secret over 3 decades. He met crew members who shook his hand and thanked him for the warning he had sent. He did not feel he deserved their thanks. He had spent 14 years watching them like animals in a cage, and had done nothing about it until the cage was already breaking. He found Admiral Osei on the bridge. She was shorter than he expected. Humans always were. She offered him a drink. It was a dark, bitter liquid that humans called coffee. He tasted it, and nearly choked. "How do you drink this?" he asked, his voice rough. "You get used to it." They stood together on the bridge in comfortable silence. The stars turned slowly beyond the observation windows. Warden hummed softly in the background. After a while, Talus asked the question that had been eating at him since the beginning. the question that kept him awake at night. "Were you prepared to fire?" he asked. If the armor had failed, if the question had not worked, if no one had come to help, did you have real weapons? Could this ship actually destroy things? Osei looked at him. Her expression was unreadable. She said nothing. Talus looked at Warden's console, glowing faintly in the dim light of the bridge. Warden spoke. "The greatest weapon a species can possess is the willingness to survive. Everything else is engineering." That was not an answer. Or perhaps it was. Talus was not sure, and he suspected he would never be sure. That was the most human thing about the whole situation. They had won the most important confrontation in galactic history, and they still would not show their cards. He left the Revenant later that day. As his shuttle pulled away, he looked back at the ship through the viewport. It was enormous and dark and strange, hanging in space like something from a dream. A ship that should not exist. A ship that had changed everything. He thought about the question that Warden had refused to answer. He thought about 400 people in a ship with no proven weapons, facing down the most powerful military force in the galaxy, armed with nothing but the truth and the hope that someone would listen. He thought about Osei's smile when he asked if the ship could fight, and he decided that humanity was either the galaxy's greatest hope or its most terrifying mystery. He suspected the answer was both, and as his shuttle carried him away from the Revenant and out into the vast, changing galaxy, he found that for the first time in his life, he was not afraid of not knowing. He was curious. Perhaps the humans were rubbing off on him.